Hey, Simon. Simon, where are you, son? Some of you may know I have a podcast co-host named Simon. He's over in LA. He decided not to fly out to New York, so he's not here today. Normally I start the show by saying, hey, Simon, and then he calls back in his Kiwi tone, hey, Jim, what's going on? That's just really offensive. He's going to hate me for saying that. But anyway, we don't have Simon, but I'll do my best to fill in. More importantly, we have a couple of awesome guests to talk to today. And the topic, before I introduce the guests, the topic we're going to be talking about is something that has been kind of gaining some awareness, some buzz in the marketing space, a term called synthetic data. There have been a couple of sessions so far in the morning here at MeasureCamp on synthetic data in its various forms. And today we're going to dive into it a little bit deeper with T.S. Kelly and Winston Li of Arima. Round of applause.
Very nice.
This is yes. We need an applause sign. That's what we need. Okay.
Right.
So, most important questions up front. T.S., what's your favorite donut?
My favorite donut?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Michael.
My favorite donut. Growing up, it was anything, as a Northeast, favorite donut's always the glazed yeast donut from Dunkin' Donuts. That's it.
Okay, glazed donut. Don't take that against him. He does really know his stuff about synthetic data, just not about donuts. Winston, what's your favorite donut?
Oh, anything sweet is good.
Anything sweet? Okay, we'll listen to Winston. Anything sweet?
Well, you want me to say like the cronut from Dominic, whatever, is from something like that? But
that would work.
That
would work.
All right, no, I'll stick to the glaze.
Okay. But seriously, let's talk about synthetic donuts. No, we'll talk about synthetic data. Let's start off and just, first of all, I feel like it's kind of on that slippery slope of becoming a marketing buzzword. And if you ask 10 people what synthetic data is, you probably get 15 different answers. So to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing and on the same page, can you just give us what's your 30-second pitch for here's what we mean when we say synthetic data?
Sure. Synthetic data, essentially that's anything generated, any data sets generated by a model is basically synthetic data. So unlike data sets that are collected from real activities like surveys, tracking, sensors, everything that's not that, but everything that's generated from a data is technically synthetic data. Although when we say synthetic data, we are generally referring to data sets that are generated to mimic the real data. So we're not talking about a bunch of random things. That is not really what we mean by synthetic data.
Right, so it's not just we're collecting a bunch of data sets and mashing them together. We're using that to then create data that mimics it.
More similar, yes.
Yes, okay. Anything to add on that, T.S.?
Oh no, it's usually about filling gaps as well. Again, many times if there is a gap in someone's data sets, many times synthetic data is either filling those gaps or recreating it entirely. So
interesting. And so some other terms that I think I've heard out there, and maybe some other people have heard that are kind of related to synthetic data, simulated data or data augmentation. How do these fit into the picture of synthetic data? Are they the same? Are they different? Are they used together? How would you define those or think about those in terms of synthetic data?
Yeah, I think it's a space where there isn't really a precise definition yet. So people use slightly different terms sometimes to mean different things, mean the same thing. And sometimes people use the same thing to mean slightly different things. So it does depend on the context, but I think in most cases, people are talking about more or less the same thing.
Okay. So it's like in the testing world, we could run geolift experiments, or we could run A/B tests, or we could run synthetic control methods, or holdout, or conversionless studies.
Yes.
Why don't we just stick with a single damn term, people? But we could have a whole MeasureCamp session about that. In fact, I'm going to put it on the board after this. Why can't we just choose a single word? Anyway.
Actually, that's really true, is that even in the space of synthetic, there is still a lot that needs to be defined of what it is, how it's used, who's using it. Again, obviously the ingredients that make into a synthetic data set. So this is not even the first inning. This is spring training for synthetic data.
Yeah, so So this is kind of early days, right? So Arima obviously is a player in the space. Are there others, players in this space that people know of that, who else is doing things with synthetic data that you know of?
Well, there was a conversation in an earlier session. We talked about Evidenza as building out I think they're building out synthetic personas and building out synthetic focus groups. They're doing other things, but if I think of what they do and where they've gotten the most attention, and that is an interesting dynamic, because then you're building out a synthetic environment where a focus group can tease out questions or build out a pre-read before going into the live environment with real ones. So that's one company that's doing something interesting. We really like what they do. We tend to be a little bit broader with our approach. Other companies that are in the space are likely, I've seen where they're adjacent to, and they're trying to, as I mentioned earlier, like trying to fill gaps. So a lot of data organizations are now using that term, like in the measurement space, like media measurement, et cetera. I've heard that term used by Nielsen, ComScore, and so forth. But in many cases, they're using it as an extension, just based on the fact that they have a lot of deterministic data sets within their organization, and they're trying to. It's kind of like building the plane while you're flying the plane, is that they have a very, very specific business model, and then they're kind of adding to that by filling those gaps where they certainly have them.
Definitely. Okay, so I think I'm starting to get a good idea of what synthetic data is. Maybe starting talking about a little bit of some of the use cases, which we'll get to. But I want to go a little bit deeper on how do we actually create synthetic data, right? Whether we're simulating the data, whether we're taking data sources and mashing them up and then mimicking them statistically. Like, we can go really deep here because we have a bunch of smart people out here listening, and maybe listening to the podcast later on. So what's step number one? What do we do when we want to create synthetic data?
So maybe before I answer that question, I'll just talk a little bit about what do people do in the space? What do companies typically do when they talk about synthetic data? And people do fall into a couple of distinct buckets. On the one end, there are companies that are more algorithm focused. So for example, their job is to create this really powerful algorithm where you have a data set, you want a synthetic copy of it, so you send it through to their algorithm, they generate a synthetic copy for you. So think of it like a little bit like a photocopier, if you will, in that sense. Gradle is a good example of that. I think they just got acquired by NVIDIA not too long ago for lots and lots of money, so they're certainly quite successful on that front. Our focus is a little bit different because and taking a step back, for algorithm-focused companies, they tend to be data agnostic, so they can work with text, they can work with images, they can work with videos, they can work with tabular data, everything. For us, it's a bit different. Our focus is very much on population data, very specific form of data. So we don't work with text, images, we don't work any of that, just tabular population data. But we focus on two things. We do two things. One, we help source the right data sources that's needed, and two, to develop the algorithms that are then used to generate a robust synthetic population data set. So that's what we do. So now coming back to your question, what's step one? Well, step one is obviously you have to have the sources. You have to have the ingredients. So there's a whole exercise that we go through on how we identify what robust data sources are, and there's a variety of criteria we look at and a variety of sources we end up using. So ranging from things like public data, so census as an example, to panels, market research, to mobility, to transaction data. So these are media consumption. These are all good examples. Or even sometimes clients would have their own data coming to us, like their own CRM tool, their own proprietary study, and so on and so forth. So that's obviously step one, identifying the sources. And I guess your question is, what's next? What's step two? So I'll just answer that.
Well, maybe let's pause there real quick and just talk. So it sounds like that's the foundation, is the data sources, right? Because if you get that wrong, it doesn't matter what else you do, it's going to be wrong. So you talked about U.S. Census Bureau data and other, how much of that is like the old data science, like 80% is data munging, the other 20% is actually doing the data science work. Is that a big part of creating synthetic data, is like finding the right data sources, making sure it's validating it, making sure it's clean and quality data? And
Certainly, that's a big part. Also something that people may or may not think about as much as contractual negotiations. Sometimes companies will say, here's my data set. You cannot build derivative products with it. You can, but these are the things you use. These are the things you have to use. And so then the synthetic data count as derivative products or no. So there's all kinds of legal complications too. So yes, that does take up a bulk of the time.
okay, and then so we have the data set.
And just to caveat that, just in case there's some legal folks listening or in the room, is that we
Get out.
Yes, we do obviously conform to like data SOWs within our client's environment. So many times what we're doing is working within the firewalls of their space to build whatever we're building. So we're not necessarily letting it roam free within the environment. But it is critical to make sure that we're using sanctioned data sets that they have. Obviously, public domain data sets such as Census, et cetera, World Bank, you name it. There's a lot of good quality ones, but I just have to say, we certainly know there are guardrails out there.
Definitely. Okay, so you collect the data, you've managed to make sure it's valid, robust, quality data, and then you do what? You mentioned algorithms, so you kind of basically run some algorithms to do step 2.
Yeah, the second step is basically to essentially merge the data sets together. One of the key unique features about synthetic data is that it's PII free. So what that means is, one, in building the data set, we don't need any PII. And the output, i.e. the synthetic version, will therefore also not have any PII. So because you don't have PII, the advantage of that is you have less approvals, there's less legal implications. But of course the problem with that is you don't have an ID to match, to join your data sets. So a synthetic data is not about joining or matching any IDs.
At least at first, right?
Right. And in fact, a lot of the data sets that we work with are not only PII free, but also aggregated. Think of the census as an example. It's not at the individual level. You don't have individual records. It tells you in this census block, X percent of people do this, Y percent of people do this. That's the type of data set that we have access to. But that's okay. The first step we do is essentially to join data sets probabilistically. So we're not saying this ID matches with this ID, this email is this address is this. We're not saying that. We're saying, probabilistically speaking, this record is likely matching with this one is matching with this one. And you're doing so by looking at non-PII keys. So things like geography, things like age, things like gender, things like, income, things like, any features that you can match against, sometimes, by visitation of locations, anything that you have available to you that you can match against. So that's the next step, essentially.
Okay. So I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate, and I'm going to be a prospect who's kicking the tires of Arima and saying, this all sounds smart and complex, and you've got a bunch of PhDs doing this algorithm stuff, but convince me I can trust it. Like, how do you validate synthetic data? If you're creating it, yes, you're basing it on real data, but what's the validation look like? How can I trust that it's accurate?
Well, I'll talk it from an EQ perspective, because obviously I don't have the IQ on the floor here, not even, or even in this room compared to people here. Is that in many cases, we actually have a white paper that was written by this fine gentleman and a few other scholars that would go out in 2020. And in many cases, that was the first conversations we have with that. It's like, well, yeah, I get it, and I get it, and also I get it, but how can I first, like, this seems fake. Even the term synthetic sound, by its very nature, is fake. So that's really where we sat even 5 years ago, where that conversation was, where sometimes the conversation would stop and start and stop and so forth. So before Winston gives you a very smart answer, I just wanted to caveat that we asked ourselves that question in the beginning about, like, what synthetic means.
Yeah, actually at my session at 2, so I have a session at 2, I'll talk about this as well. On one specific application that we use with synthetic data, so synthetic data plus large language models to predict consumer sentiment, consumer opinion, so things like, election will consumers buy certain products or not, and so on and so forth. So in that section, I will talk about validation as well, but it's kind of the same idea. Essentially, you validate your synthetic data against the source. That's what you do. So for example, if there's a real survey, we need to make sure that the synthetic audience that we're generating is statistically similar to or statistically equivalent to the real survey. So let me give you an example. Let's say this panel that we work with, they surveyed 20,000 people. They asked everyone, do you own a dog, for example? And let's say 30% of people said yes. Then if you build a 95 confidence band around that, that might be something like 28% to 32%, let's say plus or 30 plus minus 2. So then looking at the synthetic data that we create, we need to make sure that the number that we're reporting for people who own dogs is between that interval. And if it's between that interval, then we would say the two data sets are statistically equivalent. If not, then you see a deviation. And you don't do this validation on just one cohort, i.e. people who own dogs, but there are many cohorts and you can run. So you can say, what about people in New York? How many people in New York own dogs? How many people who are between 25 to 54 own dogs? How many SUV drivers with a family income of 100,000 own dogs? And again, in each of these tests, you need to make sure your data is proportionally equivalent to the original source. So to sum it up, synthetic data is not necessarily creating new information. It's in fact by design. It needs to match with the source. It's just a proportionally extrapolated version of the source.
That makes sense. And I'm no longer skeptical. Okay, you sold me. But as you were talking, you were mentioning we can see how many people age 25 to 35, living in New York, making 200,000 to 300,000 income, own dogs. And as a marketer, my mind is already saying, oh yeah, I know how I do that. That'd be useful information if I knew how many people in this area, in this income bracket own dogs, if I'm a pet food supplier, for example. What are some of so that'd be like one use case. What are some of the other use cases for synthetic data? And I know, Arima is broad, right? You haven't shoehorned or pigeonholed yourself into a specific use case like the ones that I'm aware of. Like you mentioned Evidenza, right? It's synthetic personas where marketers can basically do market research against synthetic people because it takes a long time and a lot of money to pull people into a room and ask them a bunch of questions, and they can get the same results with LLMs. So that's kind of one very narrow specific use case. What are some others that you see being used or that you've had clients use?
We'll talk a little bit more about this later on. But one of the earliest ones we did was with Coca-Cola. Mm-hmm. And Coca-Cola, they obviously do a lot of things with their brands. They own the vending machines. Even though they have lots of distribution partners, they own the vending machines that they have. And the challenge they have is that they wanted to know whether or not they made the right choice of where to put them. So talk about the core approach of synthetic data. We're able to help them build simulations that layered on mobility data, traffic patterns, other aspects of consumption that you even mentioned, like instead of dog owners, just propensity to buy soft drinks or likelihood to buy soft drinks, things of that nature. And we mapped out Vancouver and Toronto and then simulated the approach. And in the process, helped them in Vancouver to increase sales based on picking this block over that block. Now, that might not seem like a big deal. And if you live in Japan, anyone that's been to Japan, there's a vending machine on every corner, so it probably doesn't matter to do these types of analysis. But it does matter, especially with this. So Vancouver increasing sales by 60%. And they did a second round with them because they were happy. Well, the increase in sales based on picking the better spot was up 70%. So the simulation helped them make the better decisions on where to put those physical vending machines.
I love that example because it's not something that would immediately come to mind as a way to use synthetic data, right? I guess if I thought about it hard enough, I would think, oh yeah, there's probably some data set out there about like foot traffic in a major city and that, but I wouldn't immediately just assume that, right? But then the other thing that came to mind is, how much of this is just common sense? Like you tell Coke, oh, you should put your vending machine here in front of Times Square because there's a lot of people there. And they say, well, yeah, duh, of course. Like, did you actually see any kind of surprising things come out of the synthetic simulations that said, oh, you should move it down here 2 doors over because of this reason or that reason? Or like, how is it beyond just like, I hate to say just common sense, but like what someone would think, well, like, yeah, of course I'm going to put it where there's a lot of people.
Well, sometimes, as I said, it comes down to the block or the entrance to a building, the office hours of that building. So the layering in of data became, as you said even before, what was the input to there? So in certain cities, as an example, the lunch crowd and congregation of where people congregate to drink, to eat, in front of fountains and other things, you'd be surprised that even just a few hundred meters can make a difference between the usage of the machine and not. So that's where even a corner might not necessarily seem like a natural choice to walk. People walk past things where they're rushing to the train. They're not necessarily thinking of grabbing a Coke, but maybe where they slow down to look at the time of the track or whatever else. Just using examples where even a subtle nuance we saw that created a difference. And I know there were other ones too, but that's certainly a big one.
The other way also to look at this is it gives you scale. We were at the time working with Coke Canada, and in Canada, Coke has about 14,000 vending machines across Canada. So if you take the United States, there are easily 10x that amount of vending machines. So it's easy to think about the Times Squares, the here and there, but if I were to ask you, think about 100,000 places, you wouldn't be able to do that. And this is where modeling comes in, is everybody knows the Times Squares, the popular places, but that's not enough. You have just that many machines that you have to place. And so having a systematic way of doing it is likely the right approach. And in fact, before Coke engaged us, they were picking the Times Squares and the financial districts, the here and there, and that's how they were picking. But obviously, other than the top 10, top 50 locations, you very quickly ran out.
Right, and also there's the other layer of profitability, and like, how much does it cost to put your machine there where it's in Times Square versus maybe over here where it's cheaper real estate, but you maybe sell less, but it's more profitable.
Yeah. Right. There's certainly that as well.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. There's also an advertising effect too, because the vending machines, they don't actually make a lot of money. I don't know if anybody wants to guess how much an average vending machine generates in a day, but it's not a lot of money. So
I would guess, let's say $1,000?
$25.
Whoa, $25 a day?
A day.
Wow.
That's in Canada, but I would assume in the US it's probably something very similar.
Because it depends very much on where it's at. Averages can lie there.
That's right. So the machines don't make a whole lot of money at all, but there is a big advertising effect to it. So it's almost like you're getting a free billboard and you're making money with the billboard. So if you think of it that way, then it's probably a good investment.
Yeah,
the vending machine business is only 1% of Coke's revenue, but it's the most profitable 1%.
The margins are great because they own the machines, and
right.
It's theirs, no distributors involved.
All right. One question so we've talked about some use cases. Where do you see this going over the next, with AI? I used to say, where do you see this going in the next 3 to 5 years? But really, it's like 3 to 5 months. Yeah. And then you said we're in early innings here. So what's next in synthetic data land?
Well, I come from a measurement background. Just again, I can play a data scientist on TV, but I'm certainly not as smart as anyone in this room for sure. But some of the things that we're already starting to see is the simulation of media consumption, whereas that might not necessarily seem as important, but do we need to necessarily spend significant budgets on high value or high priced data sets that may only have, what is good enough to understand if I can get 80% of my knowledge done at 10% the price? I mean, in some respects, I think about the way we used to charge for targeting 10 years ago, where I'm paying all this money to have one-to-one targeting, but if my price of media is a cent and I'm paying, my CPMs are off the charts, I don't need targeting. I can just go so forth. But I see a similar type of dynamic that there are a lot of different ways I can simulate consumption or activity. Now, mind you, it was a really good conversation we had earlier about in the intent of people, their personalities, et cetera, that play a part. I do think we're going to see those things increasingly interact and combine so we can do better simulations of media consumption, product consumption, and just overall overall perceptions. I think if we were talking 3 to 5 years, I think this is going to be table stakes. I think we're going to be doing this just as a natural order of things. Like the pre-read, it's not just going to be upfronts where we get ratings. We're going to have, that's pretty much how the upfronts work. If anyone's familiar with that whole industry, is that the broadcaster tells you upfront what the rating would be, and then they try to sell you that rating. And then if they don't get that rating, they do what's called a make good. And that's been going on for decades. I think there's going to be a lot more seamlessness to the way they go about that, just based on the ability to simulate and predict performance.
Very good. All right, you guys up for a lightning round of questions from the audience? We have a question already. Okay. Here we go. Say your name, where you're from, your favorite donut, and then a brief question.
My name is Simon. I'm here from New York. I work at Umbrella Digital. Favorite donut? Just a big one. My question is, you talk about the advertising effect, which I totally get. I totally believe in that, but how do you measure that?
One of the ways to think about synthetic data is that it's a tool that provides you with more information. So what we've done in the process is we provided Coke with more data on who goes to the location, what do they look like, what their behaviors are. It is up to them to define what success looks like. Why will they want to put machine here versus there? Maybe they put the machine here for revenue purposes. Maybe they put a machine there for advertising purposes. Maybe they put a machine there because Pepsi has a machine and they need to be there. They don't actually need to make that money. They just make the money. They just need to be beside the Pepsi machine. There's all kinds of business reasons. So I'm not saying synthetic data alone is the solution to everything. I think it is a tool. It is a data set that enable you to do more with analytics, but at the end of the day, you as the brand, you still have to define what success looks like. So we enable you to do that, as opposed to we tell you just by synthetic data alone that you should do this or that. It's no different than any other data set that you acquire.
Maybe it short circuits the incrementality discussion a little bit, like a little bit of a pre-read before you might do a match market test. You might be doing very targeted awareness just based on, say, a trade zone or environment around your outdoor. So again, there's a lot of different ways that we've seen simulations from synthetic data even come up with a pre-read before they deployed a survey, just as an example.
What was the question? Or should I say name?
Oh yeah, name, favorite topping of pizza, and then your question.
Ashish Pandey, favorite topping is cheese pizza, New York, of course. And my question is, I work in data capture, like real human data capture. I see AI is being trained on the real human data capture and helping solve the problems which human has. You're working on synthetic data. Eventually, AI is generating data, and the synthetic data is all over. How you see the synthetic data is going to solve the real human problem?
How I would see data,
synthetically generated data, which is going to train the new AI models, is going to solve the real human problems.
I don't think there will be a day where AI is being generated entirely on synthetic data. There will always be the need for real data, combining that with AI. So how you combine it is an important thing to think about. I think earlier in the session, when we were all in the room looking at the synthetic agent paper, we discussed how if you rely on LLMs alone for surveys, it introduces a lot of bias. So later in my session, I'll talk about how we can use LLMs plus our synthetic society data set, which is based on real sources, to try to mitigate some of that risk. So we're not using large language models entirely. We're trying to combine real sources, the best of both worlds, so to say. So I think that's the way to go for the future.
All right, we have time for one more question. Your name, your favorite caffeinated beverage, and then your question.
Hi, Avery. Black iced coffee, a cold brew. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think my question, this might honestly lead directly into your lecture and presentation later. Given the nature of synthetic data and your suggestions combine that with Gen AI, do you have any concerns about model collapse or even just general concerns around use cases in which it would not be representative of the real world? This is something that people already see when trying to apply SMOTE in certain cases. It works in some cases, but there are cases where it doesn't work.
Actually, you were talking about that earlier when we were writing that paper of response about just the over-reliance on synthetic.
Yeah. Again, I think everything needs to have its own guardrails, so to say. So overly reliant on real data has its own problems of being slow, being expensive, and being biased too in certain ways. Real data is not perfect either. Overly reliant on synthetic data has a different set of problems. So like the previous answer, being able to combine the two is the right way to do it.
Right. As a matter of fact, some of the organizations that are approaching us, they're heavily reliant just because of their business models, programmatic, performance, deterministic data spines. They're finding they have gaps, and it's prohibitively expensive to keep filling those gaps, and they're looking at synthetic approaches to fill those gaps. Again, one's not necessarily taking over, so it's a complement versus a supplement. But by the way, he's got a really great radio voice, so you should consider coming on in the future.
You'll be our next guest.
That's right.
Well, it's that time of the day when we have to get ready to go to the next sessions here at MeasureCamp. So as you're figuring out what your presentation is going to be, to write the session card and put it on the board, which if you haven't done that yet, there's still open spaces, go do it. And as you're synthesizing your title and your description and coming up with other data okay, I've stretched that too far. The important thing is to measure up.